Welcome to the Miracle You, guiding you on the journey towards finding passion and purpose, and how to discover, create, and live a life by your design. Whether your success has been plentiful or your missed opportunities have been overwhelming, we can help you become a more empowered, masterful person and show you how to share your gift with the world. It's time to inspire change from within with the host of the Miracle You, Vince Kramer.
Hello, imagination. I'm Vince Kramer, your host, and welcome to the Miracle You, where you learn about the magic of living your life by finding the example in real life. When we come into this world, we come in with really no operating system. So we have to develop our ego or our personality. And for all intents and purposes, the ego and personality are the same thing. And as we develop this ego, it's really to help us in how we deal with people, how we deal with situations, how we perform or how we act in relationships. This personality that we develop is what makes us us in this world that we live in. But it also helps us live our purpose. It helps us live our divine intent. Now, there's lower vibrational parts of that personality and higher vibrational parts of that personality. But as we develop the personality, sometimes we pick and choose what it is that we want other people to see. How we show up in the world is based on what we want people to see in us. When that happens, there's other parts of personality that we push aside. We stuff, if you will, inside of us. And those are called the shadow parts of us. But we're everything, and we need to learn to love and accept every single part of us. So as you learn that you have stuffed these shadows inside your body, you can actually pull them up, experience them, learn to love them, and then decide if you want to use that part of your personality or not use that part of who you are. Either way, once you've learned to accept and love every part of you, now it opens you up to be able to love others unconditionally. I'm with Emerald Wilkins today. Emerald's a life coach and consciousness work facilitator who has worked with hundreds of clients. She has a YouTube channel called The Diamond Net, which covers topics under the umbrella of spirituality and psychology. If you're looking to understand more about yourself and the human condition, then Emerald and the Diamond Net are what you're looking for. Her videos and services give practical tools, alternate mindsets, and processes to help you work through issues that many people face at the same point or in some point of their life. Emerald Wilkins, are you ready to share the miracle of you with the imagination?
Sure, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
I'm so excited to have you here because as I've done research, you bring a very interesting perspective, especially as you bring psychology to spirituality, which I'm really big at making sure that people understand that science and spirituality work hand in hand, and psychology kind of gets left sometimes in the wake of everything else. So I'm really excited to share that with the audience. Before we do that, could you share a little bit more about yourself and what you're doing right now?
Sure, absolutely. So I work as a life coach, and basically what my job is to help people kind of see their blind spots that might be like holding them back from what their goals are. You know, people who get involved with, like, let's say, self-sabotaging behaviors and don't really know what the root cause of that is. Basically, I bring them through a lot of different questions and looking from different perspectives to help them kind of shake those things loose so that they can actually move in the direction that they want to move in life. Because whenever we have stuff that's going on in the shadow, in the unconscious, we can consciously want one thing, but then the parts of us that are in the shadow might want to go in a different direction. So we might end up with a lot of inner turmoil and a lot of like unnecessary fighting against these parts of ourselves. So ultimately, that's what I do. I try to make people aware of parts of themselves that might be holding them back on their journey through life, if they have a desire to go toward a particular career, or they keep ending up in, let's say, the same relationship patterns over and over again that are unfulfilling, or they end up in just situations that they don't want to be in. And it's kind of to help them get up out of that groove. So basically, that's what I do on a one-on-one basis. But basically, my channel is something that I created because I've always been somebody who's enjoyed contemplation, and in that I have a lot of insights rise up. And so it was nice to have an outlet to be able to share those things. And they've been very helpful for me. And so I really wanted to extend that to other people as well. And that's how I began with my channel.
As we walk into or step in further into what we're really here to do in the world, when we uncover that, one of the most interesting things for me to see and to also show others is that we usually walked the path of the people that we're here to serve.
Mm-hmm.
And I know in my research that you've had an interesting path. Could you share one or maybe even a couple of the wake-up calls that you experienced to move you into this life coach situation that you're sharing right now and into the Diamond Net?
Sure, absolutely. So basically, I had, like, if I start in childhood, I've always had a contemplative nature, always was questioning things. I was always a very internal person. And that was largely in response, I think, to a lot of situations that were happening in my life that created this sort of desire to pull inward and to be very self-possessed in a way, for better and for worse. And basically, as I went through life, I started to develop like different coping mechanisms to sort of get away from what I would call deep feelings of self-hatred, a real lack of self-love that came about very, very early on before I even have memory, to the point where I don't even necessarily know exactly the origin of it. But basically, once I got to be about a teenager, I started, let's say, developing certain coping mechanisms that were working better for me than before. So when I was in elementary and middle school, I was always dealing with like social isolation, ostracism, a lot of difficulties with fitting in with my peers. And once I got to be about 14 years old, 13 years old, I started to develop a lot of different, like, kind of a persona that was more robust, one where I could actually fit in. And I started to, as I got through my high school years, really develop that persona to where, I incorporated in, oh, I want to be a hard worker, or I'm a creative person. I want to add that into my persona. And that became my central thing when I was in high school, where I basically became very kind of obsessed with building this persona and building this ego structure. And with every new thing I would add to my ego structure, I would be cutting away parts of myself. And to the point where it was almost like I was kind of cutting the floor out from under myself, being very perfectionistic with how I could express myself and really who I could be. And what was before very adaptive and helpful became very, very non-adaptive. And it started to feel like reality got very thin because so much of myself had to be put into the unconscious because I was trying so hard to fit a particular mold. And a big part of that was trying to get away from that lack of self-love, the feelings of self-hatred, by trying to make myself this perfect individual. And it became this kind of almost narcissistic, vain bubble that I had like put myself in. And basically, when I was 20 years old, at the peak of that identity for myself, I happened to have a friend who was very interested in Terence McKenna's work. And he had heard of this tea that could be brewed and it had DMT as the active ingredient. And I'd never tried anything like that before, but I was interested in it. He found some at a little shop in my hometown where you brew together these two ingredients that are legal by themselves, but not legal like when you brew them together. And in that experimentation process, when I expected to just, have an experimental, like kind of, not teenage, I was 20, but like experimental kind of drug experience. And, I'm going to see maybe some cool colors or, this kind of thing. What ended up happening is that this induced an ego transcendence experience. And I basically, for the first time, recognized all of the ways that I was constantly self-deceiving. I was lying to myself constantly so that I could constantly build this persona and this ego. And the moment I would think that something was, like, think something about myself, I would assume, oh, of course I know myself, that must be true. And in this process, of like doing that, that was cutting away the floor from myself. It was making my ego very constricted and very narrow, just very clinging to this persona. And I was able to see that and how detrimental that was. And in getting that distance from my ego, really seeing how it was a contrivance that I had built, what ended up happening is all of this stuff that I had made unconscious started bubbling up to the surface of consciousness. And I experienced oneness and wholeness. And it was basically this recognition that everything was connected when I had built myself off as this separate person to cope with those feelings of lack of self-love. And in that experience, I experienced what it was to really love myself and to see, basically, the way I could describe it is that that which was going on internally for me and externally for me, there was no distinction there. The internal world of myself and the external world were so intimately connected. And coming from a perspective of being somebody who at the time was agnostic, leaning heavily atheist, I really wanted to be an atheist because I was not a fan of religion or anything like that. And basically what ended up happening is I ended up experiencing that, and I recognized this is God and this is always what I've been seeking. And I didn't realize that I'd been seeking that. And it was just this huge shift. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences of my life. And it was this experience of true connection. And basically I had that experience. And then 5 months later, I had another ayahuasca experience. Basically after that experience happened, my entire life started falling apart. It was like, basically I had been able to maintain this particular life. And it's like in that experience, just everything shifted. And then I wasn't able to keep things together anymore. And it was just trauma after trauma after trauma. And like I lost my entire social group, and a relationship that I had been in for 4 years ended. And it was a real chaotic time for me. And in that experience, I also happened to be around ayahuasca again. And for the sake of just almost like trying to cope with the situation, I was like, okay, I enjoyed this the last time. Let's try this again. And what it made me realize is that I didn't need to be successful in order to be valid. I could fail at things, I could make mistakes, I could have my life fall apart, and that it was still okay. And that basically that the universe would always like cradle me. Sorry, I'm getting a little emotional.
That's fine.
And, yeah, but basically there was I'm gonna calm down for a second. Yeah, basically there was this big shift at the time. And these shifts were incredibly positive. These were beautiful experiences. But afterward, because they were such huge shifts, and because it brought all that stuff up to the surface, stuff that I wasn't yet able to integrate, what it was like, I could describe as my consciousness was like the size of a golf ball, and then expanded out to the size of the universe. And it went back down to the size of a golf ball again. And so what it was is all the stuff that I had pushed down into the shadow, some of it was able to be integrated. Others of it, it felt like I popped a demon. It popped a bubble full of demons in myself. And now all these demons were running amok, and I didn't know how to integrate them. And basically, it was a bit like in this shift, I'd fallen down so many rabbit holes, and I had to kind of find a way to either dig myself through to the other side or dig myself out. And this took me from about the time I was 20 to the time I was about 25 to really sort that out. So 5 years in, during that time, I became a mom, I became a wife, I started being a substitute teacher and then a full-time teacher. This was a huge time period that was actually very rough to be going through this shift, this awakening. And basically I couldn't make sense of it. And I was going about it all the wrong way because I was trying to use all of my old coping mechanisms. And they just wouldn't work anymore because I couldn't do it in ignorance. And so basically when I was about 23, so about 3 years into this or 2.5 years into this, I ran across an author named Jean Raffa, who was working under the Jungian framework, the Jungian model. And I happened to find her blog online. And I started reading it, and it just felt like I was reading something from an older version of me, an older, wiser version of me. And then I got all of her books and I read them all. And then she had these great bibliographies in the back of her books with other Jungian authors and some work from Jung himself. And I really, for about a year, immersed myself in that. And I finally felt like I had started to figure out what was going on psychologically with that experience. And then that, after about a year, it started to feel like I kind of understood, and it was like every time I would read those, instead of aha moments, it felt like I started to rehash and kind of get caught in a loop with it. And then I started to have no teacher. And then I resonated with other teachers along the way. And then when I was 26, that's when I started my channel. And basically, I started my channel because it's like, it would be the things that I would have needed at the time when I was really struggling. And, basically, I've had my channel now for the past 6 years. It's where I share my insights. It's where, I share my experiences and my insights working with the Jungian framework. And yeah, so that basically kind of gives the general trajectory, and, but those were the big wake up calls. Yeah.
So the interesting thing is, it's Carl is the father of the shadow. And I think you explained it so well that we learn how to make ourselves. We learn what mask to put on to satisfy the world around us. And as we satisfy the world around us, we know the things that they want. So we find the things we don't want, and the things we don't want, we got to find some place to stuff them, right? So we stuff them inside. We try to hide them from the world. And that's the shadow. Could you share with the imagination what your definition of the shadow is?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the way that I think about the shadow and the way I've experienced the shadow is that whenever we decide I'm like this and I'm not like that, or whenever we experience different traumas and unmet needs that we can't hold space for, what happens is that we cut parts of ourself away from our conscious personality, away from our ego structure, and we put those into the dark space of the shadow. Basically, we turn off the lights on them so that we become unconscious to them. And we could do that, for a few different reasons. So basically, we have ego preservation and worldview preservation. We won't, and this was largely one of the reasons why I was, so bent on repressing these parts of myself, because I had a very specific ego structure I was trying to uphold, a very specific persona I was wanting to come across as. And so what I was doing is I was constantly saying, not this, I'm not like that, I'm like this, I'm not like that. And so that can create this shadow thing where we put these parts in the shadow. Also, worldview preservation. If parts of ourself don't jive with our worldview and it's dangerous to the maintenance of our worldview, we'll also stick them in the shadow. But we also experience this whenever an aspect of ourself has been afflicted by a particular trauma that we can't process. We'll stick those in the shadows so that we can continue to move on with our life. The same thing with unmet needs. If we have a particular need that we either won't or can't meet at the time, those parts will also go down in the shadows, so we're not experiencing those intense emotions. And so we can continue moving on with our lives. But the actual process is less like taking just some trait within our personality and putting it down. It's we really have to chop off a whole personality fragment. And so it's like a little mini personality that we kind of stick down in the shadow. So it's a little bit like we're splitting our consciousness, but those aspects still maintain their consciousness. And so they become like these almost autonomous beings, quote unquote, that end up down in the shadow, that have their own wants and needs and agendas and wisdom and perspective and fears and all of this. And so as we are, let's say, consciously oriented towards certain goals and certain things that we want as the conscious personality, the ego, the part of ourselves that we call I or me, we can have shadow aspects, these little personality fragments that have their own ideas about what they want. And they can say like, oh, I want to go in this direction. And if that happens to be the opposite direction of what the ego wants to go in, then it could be either very difficult or impossible to actually reach that goal without integrating that shadow aspect. So that's kind of the shadow in a nutshell.
Thank you so much. That was a great explanation. It's like you said, the shadow. when we're not paying attention, has a way to show up on the surface and take charge and control the direction of life for us. So one of I've done a lot of work with, I don't know if you're familiar with Debbie Ford. She left us a while ago now, but Debbie did a lot of the shadow work. She followed Carl very strongly, I guess is the best way to put it. And one of the things that she shared was the best way to heal the shadow is to shine your light on it.
Absolutely.
Could you share how you help people shine the light on their shadows?
Absolutely. So basically, there are two main ways that I go about doing that. So the first is like asking questions that they wouldn't typically ask themselves to get them looking in different directions than they usually would be looking at. And then I'll also sometimes share insights that have come up for me along the way that might give them the capacity to take on a different perspective. So if a person is looking through a particular lens, a particular viewpoint, and they haven't taken into consideration that this viewpoint also exists, then that can give them this new vantage point to see those parts of themselves. So basically, if I'm working with a person, and let's say they come to me and they say like, oh, I'm really trying to start this new business, but I seem to be procrastinating and self-sabotaging. I'm not doing the right things. And so what I might do is I might just start off with like, well, how do you feel whenever you're beginning that process? Do you feel like what are your emotions doing at the time? Are you feeling any resistance, or is it something else? And they're like, well, actually, maybe it's distraction. And then from what they answer, I'll go in deeper and I'll ask them, it's like, well, is there a sense of trying to go away from something whenever you're distracting yourself? Is it like an uncomfortable emotion, or are there certain thoughts that pop up? And so basically, it's a lot about getting them to look at the things that they would typically take for granted and to be able to see things from different perspectives through that questioning process. And another thing that I help people do is basically to crystallize things in words that they already know deep down. So if somebody has this kind of inner knowing, and something's always been going on, but they haven't quite put it into words, that they can understand with their conscious mind, that's also a way that that I help people as well. So let me think about what would be an example of that. So let's say if somebody's dealing with a certain emotional situation, so let's say that whenever they are getting angry, underneath that, they're feeling a sense of powerlessness, but these emotions are abstract and they don't necessarily put those words on it. What I might do is I might provide them an insight, or, go into a questioning process where I ask them, like, what's the emotion underneath that? And either through the lens of that new insight or through the lens of that question asking process, they are able to crystallize that, and it gets their conscious mind more on board with that inner work process.
What would you say some of the more typical shadows that let's say the populace of the US has?
Gotcha. So one thing, and I found that there's a kind of a similarity across like basically the entire world. I have like clients, and I think I counted recently, it was like 33 different countries. And basically we have powerlessness as a big one. We also have one that desires connection. One that I call the voiceless child, the child that can't be understood. The misunderstood aspect, parts of the self that feel like they were never really validated or received by their family of origin or people around them. Let's see, what else? Another really common one is what I call the inner beloved. And the beloved is an archetype that basically is able to receive love just for the sake of receiving love. And what ends up happening is a lot of people end up internalizing the idea that they have to earn love. And what this does is that gets them out of alignment with this part of themselves that is just meant to receive love for the sake of receiving it, unconditional love. And so instead of getting unconditional love, they have an unmet need. So this part of the shadow, or part of themselves, ends up in the shadow. And what ends up happening with this particular shadow aspect, when the beloved goes into the shadow, is it often becomes parasitic toward many aspects of ourself. And so what it might do in order to earn love is, let's say if somebody has an aspect of themselves that's very creative, well, the beloved might come and possess that aspect and say, oh, well, we can use creativity to get that love that we need. Or if there's a part of the personality that's a caregiver and really responsible, the beloved goes, oh, we can use that to give this, and then I can get the love that I need. Or if there's a really intelligent aspect of the personality, and the beloved also like gets its tendrils in that, and then basically it's always to get that love, to earn the love, because there is a lack, there's an unmet need there. So that's a really common one as well. Let me think if there's any others that jump out as particularly common. There are a lot of different protector aspects also. Protector aspects that keep more vulnerable aspects down in the shadow. So somebody might, let's say, kind of become a bit avoidant, to kind of avoid, let's say, exposing certain vulnerabilities. Or they might be up more in their mind. So an intellectualizer, like rationalizer aspect. So basically, there's a lot of different, very common aspects there. But I would say that the beloved probably is the one that I see the most that's out of alignment.
Which definitely points towards, the biggest beliefs that we have, especially as a collective. We're not lovable, we're not worthy, we're not good enough. And it makes sense that those type of things are what's hidden. That insecurity is put in the shadows to protect us, like you said, from the traumas of the world. One of the most exciting things about getting to interview people like you, Emerald, is the fact that everybody brings so many different things to the work that they do. And one of the things that you bring that makes you unique is you bring tarot cards into your work. Could you share how you do that?
Sure, absolutely. Well, one great quote from Joseph Campbell is that he basically said that a myth is maybe something that never happened externally, but is always happening internal to the human psyche all the time. And basically, when we think about what makes up a myth is made up of archetypes and symbols. And so when I think of the tarot, particularly certain decks of the tarot, like the Rider Waite, is that that's chock full of archetypal symbols. And basically what it is it's kind of like a mix and match myth, so if I pull out 5 tarot cards, I have a story that I can create with those cards. And so the way I like to use it is in the same way that people might use myths for the sake of understanding different very different like types of insights and things like this, and also as a way to explore what's going on in the psyche, as a viewfinder to the psyche. So I like to think about the images on the tarot as being like a vehicle that can take you into areas of the psyche that you wouldn't otherwise be able to access through a more logical, linear way of thinking about things. So the tarot gives like this visual narrative lens that is, I find, a lot more native in many cases to really being able to do this deep work, in the same way that a dream is very like visual and narrative and can be a viewfinder into the unconscious. So yeah, I kind of look at tarot in that sense. So whenever I'm working with the tarot, if I pull up a card, what I'll do is I'll give the general interpretation of the card based on whatever question the person asks or whatever question happens to be in the spread. And then it becomes like a dialogue in the same way that I would do my life coaching practice. It becomes a dialogue. Is there anything within that interpretation of the card that you can relate to or not so much? And basically through that, it's basically using that imagery to find that point where the imagery of the card intersects with what's going on in that person's psyche. Because like Joseph Campbell said, myths are always happening internal to us. So in that way, any tarot card that I pull is going to have archetypes, is going to have its own myth. And so it's always about finding where the imagery intersects with what's going on internally, because there's always going to be something that it can connect to.
Oh, that is so great. And like I said, as we bring our gifts and talents into what we do, we are unique in a way that attracts those people who need us, and that we can best help on their journey. Believe it or not, we're at the end of our time together, and I really want to give you an opportunity to share a piece of parting guidance with the audience.
Absolutely. So one thing is that during this interview, we've mostly talked about things on a more psychological level, which is a huge piece to the puzzle of like healing and of individuation and of doing shadow work. But there's also like a huge body element to working with the shadow. So in the same way that we can become unconscious to elements of the psyche, we can also become unconscious to emotions and traumas that get locked up in the body. And so the psychological element is incredibly important, but the more somatic bodily element is very well connected to the shadow. So whenever we push an element into the shadow, an aspect of ourself, it has its own agendas, it has its own needs, it has its own fears, but it also has its own emotions. And those emotions get shut down in the body. We become unconscious to those emotions. And so let's say if there's an aspect of myself that I've repressed and it's not dealt with a feeling of grief, and the body has basically come in and shut down that feeling of grief, and this part of the self has ended up in the shadow. What I would have to do to get back into integration with that aspect is to not only understand it and interface with it from a psychological perspective, I also have to be able to sit with that grief. And that feeling arises on the level of the body. So a lot of that process is unlocking that emotion from the body so that we can actually experience it with our conscious awareness, being able to hold space for it and witness it as it does its dance through the body. And then after that happens, after we've fully gotten the awareness of that emotion, the body naturally sort of lets it go. And then also parts of ourself and coping mechanisms tend to fall away, and we have to also let go of those. So that's what I would say, is that there's a more psychological element to it, but the body comes into play with shadow work just as much, if, potentially maybe even a bit more, if the shadow aspect has been repressed because of trauma. So that would be a general takeaway that I would give in addendum to what we talked about in the interview.
One thing I want to share with imagination through that is, because of this relief and because of the trauma that caused a lot of it, it's really important to have someone like Imagine Miracles or someone like Emerald to help you through the process and to help your body through the process, as well as opening you up to loving every aspect of yourself. So thank you so much for sharing that. Emerald, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I have a YouTube channel, and that's called The Diamond Net. And also what I can do is I can give you a link to this I put below, I guess, the podcast. And I also have a 6-step shadow integration process. It's a 60-minute like free class, that basically it's just a video that you can watch anytime. And you can find that at shadowintegration.org/masterclass. And so if you wanted to check out more about shadow work and you wanted to get like a good snapshot of my process, I highly recommend that's like the Shadow Integration Masterclass, 6 Steps to Shadow Integration. Or if you wanted to check out my YouTube channel, that's The Diamond Net.
So for all that information on how to get in touch with Emerald, just go to Emerald's show page at themiracleu.com. Look for Emerald's show page once again, and all that information will be available to you. Emerald, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. The information that you shared is invaluable and so important for each and every one of us as we step more fully into who we are. So thank you for sharing, and thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. On behalf of Mary, my wife and business partner, the entire team here at Imagine Miracles, we want to wish each and every one of you a miracle day.
You've completed this episode of The Miracle You, but we have plenty more to help you discover your own personal passion and purpose. Head over to themiracleu.com for free resources to assist you on your journey, as well as register for our free webinar, Discover Your Miracle Life, 3 mind-awakening steps toward your unique purpose, or apply for a one-on-one Your Life, Your Way breakthrough session and discover your next best step on your journey. All available exclusively on our website. That's themiracleu.com. We look forward to sharing more experiences of passion, purpose, and life by design next time, right here on The Miracle You.